Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Today is our 9th and final session of the Guarini School of Business Summer Speaker Series. And I sincerely want to thank all of you here today for your participation and so many of you who participated throughout the entire summer. I truly appreciate the support from all of our faculty and the broader St. Peter's University community, especially our alumni from many different decades in supporting and convening these valuable discussions. It really has been a wonderful learning experience for all. Today's session is called New Jersey Public School Funding and Property Taxes, an Ignatian Perspective, and the topic and presentation has been put together by Professor Brigid D'Souza. Brigid is a licensed CPA with an MBA in accounting from the George Washington University, and she has a robust professional background in public accounting at both Deloitte and EY, where she served in the tax, technical, and quantitative solutions groups. In those roles, she built custom tax solutions for clients using Microsoft Office, Excel, Access, SQL, and VBA. Brigid specializes in quantitative modeling, database design and management, and process automation for tax compliance and tax planning purposes. She is a former Jesuit volunteer who currently has a fiscal literacy platform called Civic Parent, located at www.civicparent.org, where she offers wonderful content about public finance, including property taxes, municipal budgets, and public school funding. She is the go-to expert for the parent community in the Jersey City area. Brigid is an advocate for open data and civic tech as a way to build skills and competencies and also strengthen community. And on a personal note, Brigid joined us 2 years ago as an assistant professor of accounting. And St. Peter's University is so blessed to have her on our faculty, and we truly value her commitment to serving our students and the broader community. So thank you, Brigid, for putting together such a great presentation today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mary Kay, for that introduction. I think you saved me some of the time on my upfront slides, so I appreciate that. And thank you everyone who's on the call for joining. I appreciate you tuning into this conversation. When I saw the invite for Summer Speaker Series, I just immediately kind of gravitated towards this topic because I just like to take any opportunity to speak about this topic because I think it's really important and it should be sort of a drumbeat of dialogue and for reasons that I'll get into on the call. So this is a bit about me. I won't kind of be redundant with the intro that Mary Kate provided, but I will mention this topic is interesting to me from a professional background because of the vast amount of tax data and school funding data that's available and sort of the complexity of how all of this data and information relates. But it's also very personal because I'm a mom to 2 children. My husband and I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, both of whom attend Jersey City public schools. And I founded Civic Parent as about 7 years ago as a way to learn about this topic and the spirit of Civic Parent. And I'll have some interactive visualizations towards the end of this lecture that you all can kind of, I'd love for you to kind of get into those visualizations and use them and make this a little interactive. But I founded it in the spirit of learning and then sharing what I was learning with my friends and neighbors. And it's kind of morphed into this sort of what I like to call a fiscal literacy platform. And what I'd like to do is look at this Ignatian perspective with through the lens and sort of with a theme of accessibility with public data and with interactive data visualizations and analytics. And we'll get more into that. So over the past 7 years, as I mentioned, I've had this blog, and what I've tried to do, and I've learned over time that, taxes are an inherently difficult thing to kind of dialogue about in community because it's a dry topic, admittedly. I find that I love the tax space because tax accountants do speak excitedly about a lot of this stuff. I know I look at tax data and accounting and tax related information and it energizes me, but I realize that that's not the case for everyone. So what I've learned over time is to build visuals and as a way to kind of meet people where they are, especially if they're especially if they're intimidated by numbers or by the, the volume of information that this topic kind of warrants. I've got up here on the screen 2 infographics that I've created. I use infographics as part of my fiscal literacy platform, and I've got in the middle some of the newspaper articles that speak to the advocacy that I've been a part of with a group, primarily with a group called Jersey City Together, which is a local community organizing group. And I've done a lot of school advocacy with that group. So this is just I want to, again, towards the end of this discussion, give you all a chance to kind of go onto my site and actually look at really the data visualizations themselves and make this more interactive. So by way of breaking into this topic of Ignatian perspective, which is what I want to hit on first, I wanted to share that I actually attended public schools in New Jersey from kindergarten through my undergraduate degree at Rutgers University. And it was a year of service with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps where I really, what I would say, was formed and really grew acquainted with Jesuit and Ignatian perspective. And I consider myself Jesuit formed in terms of my value system, my outlook, and it was an extremely formative year. And it was in the JVC from 1998 to 1999. You can see I am pictured, in that picture on the lower left. Those are my housemates, and we were at Galveston Beach. And for those of you not familiar, JVC is a year of service, kind of an immersive experience of living out these values that are on the left here: spirituality, simple living, community, and social justice. And the idea is that you live out these values with others, with other volunteers. And you work in a social justice capacity. So the house in the middle of the screen, that's an AIDS hospice, and I was a nurse's aide at an AIDS hospice. It was an 8-bed residential hospice for people dying of AIDS. And what I thought was interesting was sort of looking at the JVC values and the St. Peter's University sort of Ignatian roots, these are on the website for the university. And what I really love about this is just seeing the parallels and these roots, these Ignatian roots. You can see JVC is a on the left here, Jesuit Volunteer Corps is a 501c3 nonprofit. So, aiming to attract any young adult who's interested in a year of service, and with a Jesuit formation as sort of a base. And you can see the parallels over, underneath Ignatian roots, men and women for others, service of faith and promotion of justice. You can see the parallels here. And I think that this is what I find really exciting about this idea of Ignatian roots, I'll get a little bit more into it, but how widespread and how informing it is on how we can kind of look at the world. This is another view of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, speaks to fundamental sort of Ignatian tools, like the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, his autobiography, and so on. Now, property taxes and school funding are inherently difficult topics to get our arms around for a few reasons. And I'm just going to lift up a few, but there are many reasons. First, there can be a zero-sum aspect to the debate and dialogue, given that there is often a limited pot of public funding. So that kind of puts an immediate constraint on the conversation and a stressor on the conversation. Second, this is a complicated topic. In New Jersey, at least, there is complex litigation that sort of sits in the middle of this topic. And I'll lift up a case, there's lots of litigation. Abbott v. Burke is often cited. I know Harold's on the call, and he's been part of, we were speaking earlier at the beginning of the call about litigation that he was involved with, I believe, prior to Abbott v. Burke. This is complicated. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of history here and a lot of context. And third, I think any topic about public money is inherently complicated because everyone in community is going to have an opinion about how to use the public money. So this is a community dialogue. And as such, we need to kind of recognize that there is this collective discernment that needs to happen. So I wanted to lift up this theme that I was that I sort of, from last year's Ignatian Teach-In for Justice, which is an annual event down in Washington, D.C. area with Ignatian Solidarity Network. And this theme of radical hope and prophetic action. I think it's a beautiful theme. It sort of lifts up that, despite the depth of the complexity or the challenge, we can have hope that there's a pathway for dialogue and we can take actionable steps to get there and to move forward. So the theme I want to focus on, kind of building off this radical hope, is this idea of accessibility. And I see accessibility in this Ignatian perspective. And while putting together this presentation and rereading some of Ignatius's autobiography, I was struck by how this notion of accessibility reminded me of a painter that I studied during my undergraduate time at Rutgers while pursuing a degree in art history. And this is Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. Now, Caravaggio was an amazing resource for the church. He was an artist who painted a lot, including for the church during the Counter-Reformation period. And that could be a whole separate lecture, which I would personally love to attend and listen to from an art history expert. I know it was one of my favorite periods of study during my studies at Rutgers was the Counter-Reformation, given the art that came out of this art, like what you're seeing, like this painting on the screen. So this painting is a depiction of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, verse 9. And it's, Jesus saw a man named Matthew at his seat in the custom house and said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew rose and followed him. And it was commissioned for a church in Rome. And we have an example of this scene unfolding in a very ordinary setting. And the word here for me is accessibility. As someone looking at this, is particularly contemporary of Caravaggio's, this accessibility and this invitation to come into the scene and really understand what is this gospel reading trying to say to us. And the church is intentionally trying to do that. This is art that's intended to sort of capture these people who are otherwise potentially going to, there's the Protestant Reformation has been unfolding, and the church is sort of responding to that. So just to briefly describe what's happening here, because I think it's interesting and I kind of want to hone in on some of the detail. Jesus is on the right. He's largely in shadow, standing next to St. Peter. And on the left is St. Matthew sitting at the table and with other tax collectors, and they're shown counting money. And Caravaggio's use of light and shadow is multi-layered. It's creating not just a dramatic visual, but if you notice where the light is, it's on St. Matthew's face as he points to himself as if to say, you got to be kidding me. Are you talking about me? You want me to follow you? And you can see also his compatriots at the table. Some are still looking down at the money, and they are sort of cloaked in darkness still. And then some are looking at Jesus, and you can see the person to Matthew's left has their face is more lit up because they are also bearing witness to Jesus. And then the hand that Jesus is pointing, that's echoes of the Sistine Chapel and sort of the divine touch that Michelangelo painted. So very interesting sort of compositionally and sort of from an artistic perspective. And I think what I find most interesting, or what I found most interesting as a college student and still today, is this idea of accessibility. The setting is nondescript. Matthew and his compatriots could be in what we might consider a pub or a nondescript community hall. So you could think of, the Park Tavern on West Side Avenue, or McGinley Square Pub on Montgomery, or any setting you can imagine, which is ordinary and where any of us might go to meet. And in effect, Caravaggio has taken the exalted Christ of the Renaissance and how Christ was represented during the Renaissance, and he's humanized him. He's made him more relatable and more accessible. And this accessibility itself is very Ignatian. It's an invitation to engage with the painting and engage with the topic and engage with what we're sort of being asked to bear witness to and to believe, as a congregant at that time. And I distinctly remember in college when my professor zeroed in on some of the hands that are in this painting, and you could see the dirt underneath the fingernails. So this humanizing visual is really intentional, and it's quite frankly very powerful. So building off of that, or looking at that and thinking about, Caravaggio actually, he painted during, the Jesuits had already been formed and were practicing order. It kind of invites us to look back at this person of Ignatius of Loyola, which for me, he's a very important person personally. And I think he's clearly, very important to any Jesuit institution. So Ignatian may be familiar to many on this call. In case not, I did want to share a little bit about him. And I also wanted to, we can share all the links that are in this presentation, but I thought it would be fun to share on the left and on the right, two different ways of learning about Ignatius. On the left is a small 8-minute video called The Olive. And it's a perspective of Ignatius and a story of his life from the perspective of a Spanish olive, literally a Spanish olive that you might take out of a jar and eat. So it's meant to be whimsical, and the video starts with sort of you going into a grocery store and you encounter this olive, and then the olive takes you on a multimedia sort of tour of Ignatius's life. The other, on the right, we have the book Ignatius of Loyola, Spiritual Exercises and Selected Works, a dense history with and a really an excellent read and sort of a different perspective on Ignatius. Both of these were provided as part of a Jesuit seminar that I took 2 years ago with other professors, and as part of the Jesuit mission seminar. And it was really, the idea was to help professors and staff kind of learn more about Ignatian Jesuit formation so that we could bring it into the classroom and onto the campus. And I want to give a shout out right now to Father Claudio Bergoletta, the provincial head of the Jersey Jesuits. He led us through that seminar, and it was excellent. So again, he might be familiar, but I want to quickly kind of just give context to what I find powerful about this perspective and of who Ignatius is and how his personal history sort of informs the perspective. So he's born in 1491 in Spain to a wealthy family. And he's, to quote from the book on the previous page, the Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, he was, quote, a man given to the follies of the world, and what he enjoyed most was warlike sport, with a great and foolish desire to win fame. And then the book goes on to say that when Ignatius was 24, a magistrate prosecuted him for misdemeanors which were, quote, outrageous, committed at carnival time at night. And so, you read this and it's, I don't know about you, but I don't see a saint quite yet, right? I'm not sure if we even see a role model here. He's human. He's a very human person. I read this to my kids and they got a kick out of it. They said, I can't believe this was, Ignatius, this man that you talk about, the saint. But that's what makes him, I think, so powerful, is that he was, and his humanity we find that in his spiritual exercises and in sort of, the Jesuit order that he went on to help found. So in the early 1520s, he is injured via a cannonball, fractures his leg, and he basically is grievously injured, and he starts this period of recovery, and it's during this time that he starts his conversion. And over the next, he goes on a journey. You can see that sort of charted. You can actually go, and some of you on this call might have done this, but you can actually follow in Ignatius' steps and go on this pilgrimage to Manreso, which is where he wrote or started to write the spiritual exercises. And on the right, you can see a cave where he would go to study during that period. And you can see it's been converted into a small chapel. But, we see this period of conversion, and he's on the move, and he's in motion. And by 1540, years have passed. He's educated himself. So he's gone on to receive his undergrad and his graduate degree. He becomes educated. He's a priest, and with 6 other companions, they found the Society of Jesus. And this is all sort of a baseline to inform what I view as, what I would term as scaffolding and accessibility. So what Ignatius did was he has the spiritual exercises, which are this written coda of how to engage God in a relational way. And I know a Jesuit, one of the Jesuits from the Jersey Jesuits could, of course, take us on that journey and explain a lot more than I certainly can. But lay people are even invited into this, into being part of the spiritual exercises. You can go on retreats and that kind of thing. The program that I did, the JBC, is based on spiritual exercises, and we have this scaffolding where Ignatius creates the spiritual exercises that then informs the formation of the Society of Jesus. Ignatius and the society then go on to form this network of colleges and universities throughout the world. And that then educates and sort of promotes this worldview and this way of intentionally engaging these roots, these Ignatian roots that we pointed out up front. And then in addition to the colleges, we have we have these civil society, 501c3 profits, so to speak, in the JBC and Ignatian Solidarity Network. And these are just a listing of a few institutions. And I think that this is what, to me, is so wonderful. One of the really wonderful things about Ignatius is that he sort of helps create the roots for all of this activity. And I think, a lot of us on the call, or if not all of us, we are familiar with these roots because of either our association with the university, maybe we've attended, we're students, to, the alums on the call, and so on. So now what I'd like to do is I want to start to pivot towards this idea of public schools and property taxes with this idea of the Ignatian roots as sort of a perspective and a launch point. And I want to start out with this statue because I absolutely love this statue. It's on Glenwood Avenue outside the Student Center, and probably familiar to most, if not all of us. And it's where St. Ignatius, I love the statue and I wanted to include it because I think it has a similar effect as the Caravaggio painting. There's a relatability here and there's an accessibility here. St. Ignatius is not stuck up on a pedestal, but rather he's sitting in a very human way on a stone wall, similar to the way students might sit, or faculty or staff. And he's got a book open on his lap. If you get close enough to the book, you can see what's written, and I will invite you all to do that, to see for yourself what's written on his book. And he has a satchel strapped around his chest, suggesting he's in motion, he's still on mission. And it's very Ignatian. When I first saw the statue, and these are my two kids, the day that I actually met Father Rocco, and we started going to St. Aidan's, the university parish. So I met Father Rocco and I saw this statue and I said, that is just such a great statue for Ignatius. And it kind of spoke to me. And I think I would imagine that, and I'd hope that the intentionality of whoever put that statue there was sort of, I can see what they were going for, at least in terms of what I'm projecting onto it. And on the right side of this slide, we can see that, the university has its Ignatian roots, and this is on the website. And, this is what we are as faculty are encouraged to kind of infuse into the classroom, which I think is really a wonderful thing and an ongoing challenge and an opportunity to kind of lift Ignatius up. So now let's pivot to school funding and property taxes using this idea of accessibility as a launch point. And I want to reiterate again, this is a complicated topic. It's fraught with complexity, politics, public money, emotion. The stakes are huge because we are talking about children. And I remember saying at a public meeting one time, children can't vote, and they can't vote, therefore they rely on the adults to have an informed and meaningful dialogue that can help shape this discussion. So I would say that with all of this is a 1-hour Zoom call. It's limited as to what we can get into. I'm going to try and sort of lift up some key thoughts, but I just think that this is a voluminous topic and we could have follow-on calls that would dive into a lot of tangents. So the first thing I want to highlight is that we're talking about a set of needs. The funding here is anchored around the needs, and the advocacy that I've been a part of has tried as best possible to lift up those needs. And as I'll speak to in a second, the state funding formula leads with the idea of needs. And also the means of funding the needs. And these two things are in tension, okay? Because we're talking about a limited resource of public money, which is our tax dollars, and how we want to use the tax dollars. And we're also talking about myriad public vantage points of what public schools should look like. And this tension exists for everyone, for the politicians who are kind of charged with making decisions on our behalf. I should say the elected who are charged with making decisions on our behalf, but also the public. I've seen it in my advocacy as a parent, that this is a very real human tension. And these are some of the call outs, and I've got on the upper left, I have the New Jersey Together, which is the community organizing group that I've advocated with. I wanna make sure I lift them up, but also just say that, these call outs, and I will speak and I'll give you, I would invite you to kind of read some of what's in the bubbles here. I presented this slide at a teaching for Jersey City Together's education team back in March of 2019. And this slide was meant to, it conveys what we learned as advocates listening in community. So it's community organizing. The first step is you go and you listen in community and you understand what are the pain points, what can we organize around to help address this seemingly monolithic topic of school underfunding and school funding. And Jersey City Together, I just want to say they have strengthened and reinforced my Ignatian roots. It's an organization of member organizations. So the best way to describe it is New Jersey Together is an affiliate. It's basically a group of like faith groups and also civic groups. So the New Journal Square Association is part of New Jersey Together. St. Aidan's is a member institution of New Jersey Together. And the idea is that if you can organize people through existing organizations, then you can sort of build people power and understand the issues and advocate around the issues that matter most to people. The first step is listening. So And this listening is a way of accessing the problem, right? And I think what I wanted to lift up here is that these call outs, these very human statements like my kids' class sizes keep growing, or the school's bathroom stall doors are broken or ripped off completely and my daughter can't go to the bathroom in private. This is extremely concrete and it's accessible. It allows us to access the real meaning of what the problem is so that we don't become paralyzed from the voluminous nature and sort of the complexity and the depth of how difficult this can be to change. Because as I'll show in the next slide or two, there's a lot of policy and there's a lot of difficult, for all the reasons that I explained, that I mentioned earlier in terms of this being a difficult issue to kind of address, we have this very, very concrete call to engage the problem and to be sort of men and women for others to help address the problem. So with that in mind, and I would, I can take questions at the end about any of this, but this is what I want to get into next is just a very quick high level overview of the New Jersey public school funding. And this is really a primer. So we're shifting from sort of this human perspective that, we can hear these voices in our head to something that is much more policy oriented. And we're starting to get to some of the numbers, which can make this a difficult, this takes work to crack into, I would argue. So New Jersey public schools, I want to just hit on a couple high level points here. New Jersey public schools are primarily funded through a combination of local property taxes and state aid. And the state aid is itself a remedy that was obtained only after litigation forced New Jersey to fund its public schools through more than just local property taxes. And the idea here is that local property taxes are based on a local tax base. We have 565 individual tax bases throughout the state, and there can be inequity between those or among those tax bases. So state aid is intended to be sort of a leveling factor, a way to make sure that every state and every child in the state receives a thorough and efficient education, which is enshrined in our state constitution. But state aid is itself a complicated topic, and there's a what I would argue, very progressive but complicated formula in state law, and that's called the School Funding Reform Act of 2008, referred to also as SFRA. And the idea is that SFRA will, it sort of mandates, it builds up the needs of the children within the district based on those children's needs, okay? And this bar chart is sort of it's a visualization that shows of how the needs get built up. So the base cost would be, for instance, like a general education student. And then if a student, so every child would sort of be assigned an $11,000 or be funded $11,775. And these numbers are from 2019, 2020. And I pulled these from the Education Law Center website. So there's a base cost. But then as the children's needs go up, the funding should go up. So the idea is that the funding follows the child. And SFRA, it's in its intent, it's a progressive. When you read the law, as complicated as it is, you can see that there is this notion of assigning more funding to more need because those children need the funding to get a thorough and efficient education. And at risk is measured through the free and reduced lunch statistics. So, and this is all public data, by the way. Every district is reported, the state reports out the number of students who qualify for free or reduced lunch. So that is a measure of sort of the poverty concentration, and also English language learners. So children who are from homes where English maybe isn't the native language, they will need extra support for things like language translation services. The parents are going to need help engaging with the school. And the idea is that the resources should be there to help those parents engage. The resources should be there for the students who might come from a lower income home to have more enrichment. And that enrichment and those language services should come from the schools. That's sort of the intent of SFRA. And this slide sort of is a visual representation of what we talk about in terms of the needs. And I would say the one picture I don't have on here is a classroom and a teacher. that's the classroom is what a lot of people just immediately go to in terms of, well, that's what schools are about. It's about teaching in a classroom. I'm lifting up, and SFRA, the state funding formula, lifts up these other needs as well. And the idea here is that kids are fed in school. Kids who maybe come from families who can't, who are lower income, they are entitled to receive free or reduced price lunch. Kids are transported to and from school via a bus, public transport. Schools provide care before and after the school day for parents who have to work. Schools provide after school enrichment like sports, drama, and clubs. This is part of the education. Schools help guide students through pathways to college or vocational training, and they need counseling to help do that. They also need counseling if there are traumatic incidences that happen, in community or in their homes. Students should be getting that assistance, that social and emotional support. Schools take care of kids who fall sick. They help kids who may be traumatized, and they provide enrichment activities like class trips. So again, this idea of funding the needs and the idea of there being a level playing field for every child in New Jersey who attends public school. They should all be sort of starting out from this sort of common starting point. And this is just really meant to just emphasize the point that the students who have more need should receive more state aid. And that's kind of like to kind of distill the state aid formula down to sort of the essential. That's sort of what's happening here. And I will, it's a very complicated formula, and how it's been implemented is complicated as well in terms of just the complexity of how it hasn't been fully funded. There's interplay with the local tax base, and it gets very, very complicated. But I think the key point here is the need follows the child, and the funding should follow the need. Okay, so at this point, we just went through a couple of slides of policy and sort of numbers just to scratch the surface. And I like, this is a little bit of levity. Like sometimes policy can kind of be a hindrance, almost like be a roadblock. For some of us, it isn't. Like I love reading through all this stuff. I enjoy going to budget hearings, public meetings, but that's not true of everyone. And so the question is, how do we cut through the noise? How do we cut through some of the denser material here and so that we can open up and break open this conversation for everyone? And this visual is kind of the teacher in Charlie Brown who's talking and has that sort of sound of want, want, want. And that's kind of, I will share that as a tax accountant, I've had countless conversations with people in casual settings where I say I'm a tax accountant, and their eyes kind of glaze over. And while I find it very interesting, not everyone does. And I want to admit that is part of the challenge here. So what I want to kind of sort of round this out with, because I'm nearly done, is that we have voluminous data. We have this paradigm that we know exists with state aid and local property taxes. How can we break this open and invite people and make this more accessible and invite more people into the conversation? And shown here on the screen is I pulled this off the Education Law Center, and it shows this, the table is showing the towns that have red boxes around them. These are in Hudson County, are underfunded. So they are not getting the full funding that the state formula says they should be getting. So these kids are underfunded in their local public schools. Adequacy is called, and I'll just highlight this blue bar. That's kind of what, if SFRA were fully funded and the local property tax that goes to the schools were fully funded, this is Gutenberg as an example, then there will be $27 million of funding, okay? But the state and local revenue is only adding up to 19 million. So there's about an $8 million shortfall there. And that $8 million is money that is not funding needs that do exist in that school system. Now, I have gotten to the point where I can read this table and I'm comfortable reading it. I know what these terms adequacy gap and required state aid and state aid gap mean, but this is not legible. I would argue this is not legible to a first-time viewer. So Education Law Center is a great example. They have wonderful data visualizations on their site. This is a small snippet of one of them that shows this gap between what should be funded versus what's actually funded. And then there's also a time series, so a horizon of about 10 years, actually about 12 years now, showing this blue and yellow disparity over time. So you can kind of get and this I think is great. I lift this up, by the way, to students in my accounting classes. This is basic analytics. So and that's what I think is very exciting about the idea of infographics and the idea of accessibility, going back to this notion of accessibility. And I have a firm belief, this is what drives a lot of my advocacy and what I do on my website. Community can grow empowered by cutting through what some of us might call the noise of tax and school funding, these kind of very high level terms, by understanding the issue from a highly personal perspective. And we can do that by inviting community in to discuss, and I'm gonna share. So Mary Kate has put in the chat a link, and I hope you all can access the link, and it's a link to what I'm showing on the screen. And it's basically, I have 5 sample visualizations based on public data, and they are meant to be an invitation to kind of go into the public data in a manner that is interesting to you. And I've actually created these visuals for people in community. This visualization I created recently, and I'm sorry, on the screen, and it is to show the fragmented nature of New Jersey's public school districts. So each box on the screen is a different school district in New Jersey. There are over 80 charter schools. So this includes charter schools, which are separately administered districts. And each of these districts was charged with creating a COVID-19 plan and also like a health response. And so I created this visual as part of a recent post on my website to show what that kind of looks like. And also what I lifted up, and if you're on the website, and what I'll do is I can flip to the website in a second, but if you hover over one of these blue boxes, you can get a visual of some of the high level statistics. Like, what I've shared here is free and reduced lunch percentage, because I wanted to show, number one, the sheer number of districts, but also the varying degrees of need within the districts, which then informs how capable that district is going to be able to respond to reopening in the fall. That was one of the things I was going for this visual. I've also created a breakout of property tax, and you can go into any municipality in New Jersey and look at how your public property tax dollars are used. Meaning you pay your property tax bill, how much of it goes to the municipality, how much of it goes to the county, and how much of it goes to the local public schools. And this is really just, people don't necessarily know how their tax dollar is carved up. I think it's visible on your tax postcard, but this is meant to make it slightly more accessible. And also you can compare and contrast different towns. And finally, this was a really cool tool that we created. It actually wasn't my idea. It was 2 moms who I was working with. We're part of a much larger team. And they said, the idea here was we were advocating for a local levy increase to fund the public schools in Jersey City. And part of this challenge is helping people understand $52 million, that's the aggregate investment that we know is needed. We've done the analysis. We know that that's a large number. We know it's needed for the Board of Ed to approve that number. But that scares people, legitimately so, because they don't understand, what does that mean for my home and how much my taxes are going to increase. So we created a tool that allows you to input your assessed value, and it kind of spits out your change annually in school tax expense and monthly school tax expense. And when you show people the monthly change in school tax expense related to their assessed value, it makes it more accessible. They can kind of understand, okay, this is my small contribution to this much larger number of 52 million. And so that's my lecture. I have about 15 minutes left. I'm happy to go over, but I'm happy to take questions. And I also am happy to kind of if you're playing around, I would really encourage you, I hope you have a chance to kind of click on this website. And this is my website. And the idea here is that use the drop-down boxes, and you can kind of, go into a county. So I can go into Hudson County, and it should update. And if the website is slow to load for any reason, you can always click on the bottom. So you notice this by the way, just updated for Hudson County. So you can it zeroes in on the county. And you can also click down here and you can click on the link and go to the actual Tableau site. So this software that I'm using here is Tableau. And I love to use it because it's interactive. It allows people to kind of interact with the software. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because I know I've been talking for about 40 minutes and invite any questions. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Brigid. That was really, really fantastic. I like how you moved from the Ignatian Foundation, because I was really wondering how you're going to approach it. You did such a fantastic job of applying it to the current situation with the budget and school funding. This is a relatively open discussion here. If you know how to use the digital hand raising, I see Ray Butkus has his hand up. You could click on the participants button on the bottom of the Zoom screen and raise your hand digitally. And if not, once we don't have any hands raised, if you have a question, you could feel free to unmute. So I'm going to hand it to Ray, and then he'll be followed by Bill for questions. So go ahead, Ray.
Thank you, Dean Natus. Brigid, well, listen, I'm a bit past the age where my kids are in school, so I perhaps don't have the hound and the hunt that you do, or Mary Kate does with 2 and 3 kids going to public school. And my comment really is less about your content of this presentation and more about the meta content, if you will. And for that, I would say, bravo, well done. I'm a big believer in and an adherent to the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary method of teaching and learning. And over the past 40 minutes, you've brought in theology, civics, art history, a little bit of accountancy, and wound it together in a wonderful story. And I think it illustrates that regardless of what we teach, we can do so by remembering that we're doing this in a context of a Catholic Jesuit institution of higher education. And I think your presentation illustrated that absolutely beautiful. And for that, I would say, bravo.
Thank you so much, Ray. I really appreciate that. I really do.
Brigid, wonderful presentation. I have 2 questions. First, how did you go from being an art history major into becoming a tax accountant? And then secondly, on a more substantive note relating to your presentation, what ultimately do you think is the solution? Should we, I know one of my brothers lives in Englewood Cliffs, a very wealthy town where there are relatively few kids, so their property taxes are relatively low in proportion to the value of their homes. And I just think that a state income, funding the schools through the state income tax would ultimately be the best answer. Do you think that's, and perhaps some form of wealth tax as well, but do you think that might be viable? And maybe Joe Doria and Ginger could comment on that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think a reasonable question. I'll start out with the first point is I was a dual major at Rutgers. So I was a business major, and I majored in marketing, but I took art history as part of my core, and I loved it that I doubled up as much as possible just to take, and so I ended up getting a degree in it, and I really loved it. So that's how I was in art history, got the art history degree. And then I later went on to get my MBA in accounting, and that's where it kind of led me to the path of being a CPA and a tax accountant. The answer to the second question, which I think is reasonable, is I don't know. And I think that is what I think is ultimately so important about this notion of intersectionality between taxes and what we're funding, the needs, and why we need an informed and robust public dialogue. And I think, there are people on this call, like Harold is an alumnus who I've recently, because this presentation, came into contact with, who's an attorney involved at the very beginning of the state litigation. I can't imagine how much knowledge he has just in terms of being on this path and being part of the initial efforts. Ginger being part of NJEA and being from the teacher side and from the educator side. And, you know, Dr. Doria just being, you know, also understanding, I know I spoke with him briefly a couple of years ago around his experience in Mayo. And I think that there is such a multitude of perspectives on this, and we need a dialogue that kind of allows us to have this public understanding of the needs. And I think we need to discuss more the needs. And I think if it's okay, you know, some of the back and forth I have with Harold, and I hope it's okay that I share this, is just the importance of maybe shifting the paradigm of how we look at this. Like, the children being educated that's got to be the leading point here. And right now it's really the taxes and the expense that arguably, and I've seen this, and what I've tried to do with my advocacy and with the interactive visualizations, and I think what we have up on the screen here, the little school tax expense calculator, it's meant to disengage the fear of tax and instead allow more space for talking about the needs. And I'm willing to say I don't know what the answer is, Bill, but I know I want to be involved in the conversation. And I'm sorry I don't have a quick answer for that, but it's an honest answer.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ginger?
So Brigid, congratulations on that excellent presentation. And the thing that I like, I love your point about making that, like, data and facts about schools accessible. I will tell you that, so I worked for NJA for 22 years. School funding was an area that I lobbied, before I became the director of government relations, I lobbied on school funding for 10 years. I was in the room when they were writing CIFRA. I was through 2 iterations of CIFA, the law before that, and we lobbied and did a lot of advocacy around this law. I remember I had just come back from maternity leave, and this was like the big project. One of the struggles that you always have when you do a school funding formula is that we have all these court cases, and I see there's expertise on those court cases far greater than mine. But one of the thing you struggle with is, what does adequacy mean? How much is the right amount? And so all these formulas take a stab at, they have to balance, there's a tension, right? One side is affordability, how much can the public pay? And the other side is, how much do we actually have to spend in order to help all of these children meet the constitutional standard, you know, that all these districts are able to give their students a thorough and efficient education. And Christy Whitman had one view of it where, you know, money doesn't matter, what matters is the results. And then later on, you know, we have lots of cases after that which show, well, we're kind of not getting those results. And like, I think the court at some point throws up its hands and says, if we can't prove that this is that you know, the results are going to be the same, we have to make sure the money is at least there for these programs. To go to what Bill was saying about it, I always said, this is something that could be solved if resources were unlimited, if we had all the money in the world. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you're trying to measure something with adequacy that is kind of, we make up ways to measure it, but on a large scale, you can't measure it adequately, right? It's just not, how do we know that a child has met standards? I don't think tests are great measures of that, right? There's so many things in education that are not measured by a test score, and there was a push for a while to use like data from tests to drive that answer. But the best thing that you do, when we were lobbying on this law, legislators, and Dr. Doria can comment on it as well, there were legislators whose eyes would glaze over. Like this law was 200 some odd pages. It was passed in the middle, it was passed in January. They were doing this during Christmas. No one had the time, the bandwidth, and like you said, it was very complicated to understand. And you rely on all the experts and the advocates and the people around them to try to come up with the answer. And while it wasn't a perfect solution, it was a solution. But just to end what I'm saying, the biggest problem we have with any funding formula, I don't think any of the funding formulas we've had in recent years, CIFA, CIFRA, the problem is funding it. What happens is we create a funding formula, we fund it for the first year, maybe the second year, and then the budget gets tight and we stop running the numbers. And when you stop running the numbers, you don't know how much each district can get. And then you start, like, people complain and advocate. And so you give them extra money, you give them extra money, and then you keep the money the same, even though, and you don't run the formula, and neighborhoods change and it becomes useless. So I always say about a funding formula, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And the way that and what you're saying is actually the answer. We have to make this accessible enough so that legislators, so that parents can engage knowledgeably with the formula, understand what their children are entitled to, and create solutions from that understanding or that knowledge. So thank you. I think it's great.
Thank you, Ginger. You know, it's interesting. One thing I've learned as a parent, and you just kind of hit upon it, parents have a limited time period, and Ray kind of spoke to this as well, a limited time period in the school system. We have maybe, depending on how many kids you have, you've got maybe 12 to 14 years. And then your self-interest shifts. So that's another aspect of it. It's so complicated, and yeah. And some would even argue, and I'll just share this, and this is kind of go back to Bill's point. You know, some people will say, well, maybe you need to consolidate school districts. And as an accountant, you know, you wear your accounting hat and you say, okay, yeah, there's a lot of redundancy among the school districts. And if you consolidated school districts, you would have less redundancy and less expense. That's just one view of it, though, from an account, you know, wearing an accounting. And you talk to a lawyer who's in mergers and acquisitions, they'd see that as making infinite sense. But then you go from the educator's perspective, or this, we're steeped in home rule as a state. It's complicated. But thank you, Ginger. I appreciate those comments. And to hear about that, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in some of those discussions.
Thank you. Harold has his digital hand up. Harold?
Yeah, I enjoyed the presentation a great deal. Because it brought in a different approach to the perspective. But I have a fundamental problem with everything we've discussed. And it's probably because I went to Jesuit high school and Jesuit college. We have allowed non-educators to define the parameters of the discussion about school funding. The theory behind public education goes back to basic constitutional principles that every democratic right depends on an informed and educated public. That's why free public education became such an important part of this country. And the writers of the Constitution actually said in their writings thereafter, it was the failure to include mandatory public education, which was one of the great failures of the Bill of Rights. So what we've done is we've talked about needs in terms of school district needs, or needs of the collective group of children. We've talked about how much we can afford. We've used measures that we would use against no other right. So for example, no one would say, well, we really can't afford to have that many people tried, so let's eliminate trial by jury, or let's wipe out judges, or let's eliminate voting because it's just too damn expensive. The answer is really simple. Redefine the term. Go back to, we're dealing with children. Educators should be able to, and they do in case of children with limited abilities, they're able to literally write a prescription for what that child needs. Add those needs up child by child, district by district, and come up with a single state number. And then either fund it or don't. But don't allow the children who live in Summit to have a higher quality of education because the tax burden is less than it is in Camden or Jersey City. And don't let supplemental programs be funded out of public funds in Summit that cannot be funded in Jersey City because the real estate population property is too poor, or state aid is too low. let's forget about the term state aid. The obligation that's imposed in the Constitution is imposed on the legislature, and it's imposed to create a thorough and efficient system of free public schools. It doesn't provide that they'll only provide aid. The obligation to run the educational system is a statewide obligation of the government of the state, not of the municipality, not of the artificial school district. So I think what has to happen if this is going to be solved is we need to simplify, identify the needs of the individual children, determine them collectively, which is simply a matter of adding up what the cost of those educational prescriptions would be, and then either fund it or not at the state, so that the interest of the voters in Summit and the voters in Jersey City with regards to education is the same. If they don't fund it at 100%, the quality of education in Summit is not going to be what it is today. And if they do fund it at 100%, then the quality of public education in Jersey City is going to be a lot better than it is today. So that's my view is we allow it to be complicated because we allow politicians and tax people, with due respect, Professor, and people who are interested in the dollar side of the equation as opposed to people who are interested in the child individually and their individual needs. And that's my perspective.
Yeah, that I would say that makes a lot of sense. You know, I have definitely seen that, and I mentioned it earlier. You know, the taxes and the idea of tax is the leading kind of that's the leading discussion in most public meetings I've been to, and then when you bring this topic up. So, and what if it's sort of a paradigm? I mean, you're suggesting, if I can call it, like a paradigm shift in how we're talking about the topic. So yeah, really great points.
Thank you, Harold. I don't see any additional hands up. Any last thoughts? I think Jean Doria may have dropped off here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks for joining. I do want to, Mary Kate, if I can, Bill Armbruster mentioned in the chat that Franklin Walker, the Jersey City School Superintendent, will be the guest speaker at the Journal Square Community Association meeting on Saturday, September 12th from 10 a.m. to noon. And it'll be live streamed on their Facebook page. So I just wanted to call attention to that in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Bill. And I just want to give a huge, huge thank you to Brigid for putting together this extremely thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation today. I think we definitely need a second discussion, maybe sometime in the fall, and I would love to invite everybody back to join us for that. Thinking about COVID and remote learning and the inequality that is only going to be exacerbated right now is really scary to me, and I just worry about all of our children, whether you're in a privileged position or not. And I think I would love to reconvene this topic in a few, Brigid, if you're open.
Yeah,
to that.
Absolutely.
I want to thank our alumni. Thank you so much for joining us and contributing to the conversation. Thanks so much to my colleagues at St. Peter's who have been wonderful participants throughout the summer. And I look forward to reconvening these virtual discussions. I think it's something we could have been doing all along. We didn't need a pandemic, but it's a great way to bring people together to discuss important topics, kind of in the middle of the day where it would be impossible to get everybody together physically. So again, thank you to everybody for all of your contributions during the summer speaker series, and look forward to the next round of discussion on this very, very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the program.
Okay. Take care.